Hello, everyone. Today is about the positivity. So, when we learn about things in environmental science, it can be kind of overwhelming. It can feel hopeless. And so, we always want to remind ourselves what is being done or what can be done. And so, this one is kind of on focusing on saving our species. What can we do about it? So, first of all, to understand how to save them, we need to understand kind of how in risk they are. Okay, so the top of this list here, the black extinct, that means they're gone. It's too late. And then if you look at the bottom here, obviously, it shows you extinction risk. So it's not really considered risk of extinction unless it's at least concern. Anything below that is just that's fine. Um, and then near threat, and then vulnerable, and then endangered and critically endangered. So obviously, most of these words just make sense. I don't think there's much point in going over them significantly, but I do want to point out extinct in the wild. Extinct in the wild means that this species no longer exists in nature, but there might be a few species left in a zoo or some kind of controlled environment. So EW, extinct in the wild, means that there's no wild species left. Okay, so honestly, the most important thing that we can do to save species is to protect their habitats because most of the numbers that are dwindling are habitat related. So we'll see kind of in this slide here. So this is specifically in the United States. 98% of the prairie biomes have already been lost. So that means that a lot of the species that live in the prairies have no home anymore. So we're going to see those species go extinct, and I'm sure many of them are at risk already. 50% of wetlands have been lost, so half the wetlands that we have in the United States, and 90% of the old growth forests have been destroyed in the US. It may actually be even higher than that. These are slightly older numbers, but with all the fires that we've been having, it might even be higher than that. So just keep that in mind. Oops. This is just showing you where forests and other wooded land is around the world. And so you can see it's kind of it's kind of along two lines. There's one kind of line here and then a big section here. Those are where you're finding most of the wooded areas. So if we want to save this habitat, we need to focus, we need to be specific about what land we choose. So remember we talked about how edge habitats are not great. So we don't want to break something into chunks. So if the goal is to save a specific biome or whatever, make that core area complete preservation, meaning that that is an area in which humans essentially don't go into. There's a few exceptions here and there, but we essentially leave it alone. Then there's what's called the buffer zone, and those are going to be limited activities. So limited development, only X amount of houses can be built in that area. And usually they'll be specific for a reason like research, education, tourism. So most of the time, that's not going to be your human settlements. Again, there might be some specific housing for research and education type stuff, but most of that is going to not be in that zone. That would be in the transitional area. So this is where you'll have most of your human settlements and then whatever is beyond that area. So the goal is that the center area, we really leave untouched so it can just be doing its biodiverse thing. When we're trying to study and protect organisms, species, there's in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. And what that means is in situ conservation is trying to protect that species in its natural environment. So it's in its prairie land or whatever. Ex situ is sometimes these organisms have to be taken out of their natural environment and fed or whatever. And so that would be outside of its natural environment. So you can see in this picture, it's like a hand with like a bird puppet on it that's helping to feed the birds because their mom or whatever died. Who knows the story behind it? But this is clearly in like a zoo or a lab or something like that. Another thing that we've done to save species is the Endangered Species Act. When in doubt, think about the 70s. If you do get a test question, you really don't know the year, go for the 70s. So 1970 is just when a lot of the big environmental movements happened. 1973 was the Endangered Species Act, and the purpose was it's specifically for the United States, so keep that in mind, but it was designated to save and protect endangered species. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible, so they're the ones who are supposed to enforce this, if you will. And there's a lot of kind of specific words that they use. Species can't be taken, threatened, killed, harmed. Their habitat can't be harmed. There's kind of like some trigger words. But again, that's enforced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which doesn't have Anyway, doesn't matter. This was a list I pulled up in 2020, on the top here, United States foreign and total, for the different groups that are endangered or threatened. So just to give you kind of, you can pause this and look at it more if you want to, but just to give you kind of a perspective on what types of organisms are marked as endangered. Please understand that to be marked endangered, you do have to go through a process. It's not just like, oh, there's this number of worms now, like let's add it to the endangered species list. It's quite like it's a pretty significant pathway to getting put on the endangered species list. So there might be things, animals that are threatened or even critically endangered, etc., that are not on the endangered species list. So keep that in mind. These are just the ones that are officially on that list. In terms of like how we continue to save, we need to make decisions based on biology, not on our hearts. I know that sounds weird, but like we tend to focus on species that mean something to us, and that's really not a great reason for them to be put on a list. We need to have it needs to be a little more holistic. So if we're putting a species on the list, it needs to be recoverable. We need to have some kind of recovery plan, and the numbers need to be high enough that recovery even has a chance. So again, it's not just like, well, we have to save the pandas because we like pandas. We really do need to put that thought into it to make sure that they are even recoverable. So right now there's about 1,300 species listed, and a lot more that are candidates but have not been added to the list yet. So, Endangered Species Act is not perfect. I mentioned some of this before, but so one messed up thing is like if a species is about to be put on the endangered species list, it might encourage landowners to destroy the species on their land before they get on the list, because then they have to protect them. They have to protect that land. So let's say you buy a plot of land and you want to turn it into a farm, and there's some protected prairie dog on it or whatever that need the grassland in that area. If it ends up on the endangered species list, you can't get rid of its habitat. Now you can't build your farm. So sometimes people will destroy that organism before they get on the list, so that they don't get in trouble or whatever, and then they don't have to protect them. It doesn't focus on the entire ecosystem, and a lot of times, without that all-encompassing look at things, you might not save the species, because there's that trickle-down effect. There's that food web going on, that balance, and so sometimes we make efforts, and then because the ecosystem is not the focus, it doesn't work out. And then again, it focuses on charismatic megafauna, big words for mostly animals that we have our hearts attached to. It's not, people don't usually cry over the little worm or bacteria that's endangered. It's usually things like the panda that humans focus on. And so it's not really representative of ecosystem needs or species diversity. It's focused on our hearts. Here is an example of a successful endangered species movement. So the bald eagle conservation movement. The bald eagle started declining for a couple of reasons. Part of that was a huge loss of habitat. They were hunted as well, but one of the biggest things was DDT. When we talk about Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring, we'll talk more about that, but it's basically a pesticide. It's used in other ways. It was used in other ways as well, but the main focus was used as a pesticide. And what happened was the shells were weakened. And so when the bald eagle would sit on the shells, shells were sit on their eggs. The shells were so weak that they would literally kill their babies. So that was one of the big problems, is that they weren't hatching. And then when they did, they were often weaker as well because of the DDT, because it moved up the food chain. So we'll get to those trigger words later, but it moved up the food chain, and bald eagles are high on the food chain. And so they had a high concentration of DDT in them. And so in 1963, there were only 417 nesting pairs left. So that's very, very low numbers. And by 1994, they were actually removed from the list. They are no longer considered endangered. The recovery plan was fairly intense. One of the things that they had to do was actually get the eggs out of the nest, because again, when they sat on them, they crushed them because of the weakness of the shells. So they would need to get the eggs out, take them to some type of hatchery, and keep them, incubate them, etc. And then right before they hatch, they needed to get them back to where they needed to nest. Now, I'm sure some of the times they actually, maybe let them hatch naturally in their facilities, but sometimes they did actually try to get those eggs back into their mom's nest, which is pretty cool when you think about it. Now, when it comes to imprinting and things like that, birds can be a little challenging, and also their actual parent may not take care of them if they've been seen by human, smells, blah blah blah, all these things. And so there were actions taken place, like this glove here, to make it look like a bald eagle was feeding it when it was feeding time and things like that. So they really were very thorough with their recovery plan. You can see another kind of fake eagle up here feeding the babies. You can see these humans covered in camo carrying the birds to their location, really doing as much as possible to. There's another picture I've got in here somewhere, to try to get them to be able to be reintroduced to their natural environment. Because sometimes if you do breed in captivity, the animal never learns to feed for itself, to fly, to whatever, and they can't actually be reintroduced. This I think is just so cool. And in Catalina, there was a guy who did this too. I don't know if this is him, but they would repel, or be dropped down. There were lots of different ways, mostly repelling, but a lot of different ways they would do this to get the birds to and from their nest. So sometimes they would dress like a bird. They would put the like take the eggs out and put something in placement of the eggs so that the mom is still like sitting on what she thinks is her eggs, and then at another point go back up there, take the eggs and put take the fake eggs and put the real eggs back. So a lot was put in to the success of these guys. And so bald eagles were successfully reintroduced to the state of New York. So this was the trajectory from 67 to 2007, and are no longer on the endangered species list. So really, really good thing happened. And they're not the only story, certainly. So this is the striped bass, and we started to see their populations go down significantly, mostly over harvesting and things like that. And the plan went into place, and we definitely saw recovery above, where we're kind of, that's our restoration goal. We got it above the restoration goal. So declared restored in 1995. So this actually, you're talking really a 10-year recovery plan for this species, based on their, reproductive strategies and things like that. So it's possible to do it in a human lifetime, for some species. One of the things that we need to do to save these species is to restore damaged or destroyed habitat. So I mentioned in a previous presentation that wetlands, we've really kind of done the wetlands dirty. We associated wetlands with being dirty swamp, things like that. Oh, so gross, blah, blah, blah. And we were kind of tearing these down. They're often near waterways. So we'd build condos and apartments and things like that for the views near the water, and not realizing how important wetlands are. And so we are starting that process of reclaiming wetlands, and they're really important to many species success. So restoring some of those damaged habitats is really important. Seed banks, not the first time I've mentioned this either. It can save plant species. So if we cryogenically freeze them, it sounds very Avengers, but they can be stored a really long time and save those species. And we want to make sure that we store them in multiple locations, because if something happens to one area, maybe there's like a volcanic eruption in some area and it wipes out an entire seed bank. If that's the only one we have, that's obviously going to be problematic. So we need multiple locations to store these seeds. In terms of botanical gardens, there's a lot of cross fertilization. So, kind of breeding, if you will. Some of that's natural, some of that's human caused. And I ask a question on there: what's the difference between cross fertilization and genetic modification? First of all, cross fertilization happens naturally in some circumstances. When we are purposefully crossing different species, we're not modifying the genes; we're just selecting traits that we are, so artificial selection. Whereas genetically modified things, we're changing on a DNA level, so a little bit of a difference there. And then asexual reproductive, I don't know what I was trying to say here. Blah, blah, blah. So some species asexually reproduce, but that means that there will be no genetic diversity. If you're mating with yourself, you're not going to have genetic diversity, or very little genetic diversity. So cross fertilization can help us to keep genetic diversity within the species. Aquariums are doing a lot of great things. Aquariums and zoos, people have lots of opinions about. Feel free to have your opinions. But I encourage you to think about the goods and bads of all of these things. Aquariums certainly have some issues, but there are good things that they do. A lot of aquariums are growing their own coral, or even trying to figure out how to grow coral in a natural environment faster. Since we're seeing so many corals die out, how can we increase the speed in which they reproduce, and so that we can see those natural populations rebuild in a timely manner. A lot of times, aquariums will rehab injured animals, so they'll, if a sea lion gets injured or whatever, they can rehab it and try to re-release it. And I think it's also really important to raise public awareness so that these species are cared about in order to save them, because a lot of times that is a factor. Zoos, same thing. A lot of people have very differing opinions about zoos. And I'm not saying that everything that they do is correct, but some of the things that they do that are good things, artificial insemination, so artificially impregnating certain species in order to keep genetic diversity, keep the population going. Embryo transfer, same thing. Maybe there's uh, an animal that doesn't have any eggs left, and another animal that can donate the eggs to that species. Literally, kind of what we do with humans when we have trouble having babies as well. All those things are happening in zoos as well, to try to keep genetic diversity and to try to keep species alive. Good and not, good and bad with that, right? Like, so it's not natural, right? But it may save the species. So I don't know. I don't have an answer on whether it's good or bad, but it's important to know about. And of course, there are some international conservation efforts as well, so like the World Wildlife Fund. Again, I'm not going to list those names off. There's a couple organizations there, and their goal is to try to salvage some of these areas or save species or whatever. And they definitely work in different ways, but their heart's in the right place. And then in terms of world conservation strategy, the goal is to preserve biodiversity, but also make sure that we have sustainable use of the resources that we have. It's not like we're going into other countries saying you can't use this at all. We're trying to figure out ways to sustainably use those things, ecotourism, things like that. If you cut down a tree, let's plant another, that kind of mindset. And then also stabilize human population. And I'm not going to go a lot into that. We will hit human population a lot later. Cities, so the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, we talked about how a lot of species are traded. And so 128 countries, at least at the time that I made this, have signed that to say, hey, we won't trade these certain species that are endangered. So it prohibits the trade of live specimen or products of 675 species currently on the list. So some countries doing their best not to trade endangered species. Got to maintain those habitats, right? So we have to identify ecosystems in danger, protect them, rehabilitate them. One way to do that, sometimes these habitats are on private property, and so we need to incentivize private landowners to protect those species or that land or whatever it is, and whether that be some kind of government tax rebate or whatever. It can look a lot at, it could be a bonus for or whatever. There's a lot of things that you can do, but incentivize them not to destroy that species or destroy that habitat. When it comes to migratory animals, birds, whales, things like that, you have to protect the animals' breeding ground and wintering grounds. Otherwise, it's not going to work. That was an issue we were seeing with the monarch butterflies. So you have to make sure that there's cooperation there, because sometimes that can be in two different countries. Okay, so you've got to protect both. If you can't breed and you can't, build up your fat storage over the winter, it's going to be problematic. The International Whaling Commission bans whaling. That was in 1986. I don't think this is one you need to know in specific detail. It's not one that I know a lot of details of. But it did ban a couple of the types of nets, gill netting and purse seine netting. We'll go more into that when we look at aquatic species. One of the best ways is just increasing public awareness. This is not this person, but Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, she brought it into public knowledge that DDT was killing species, and that was the catalyst for a huge change. Little things like the leftover net here that tangled up into the species and killed it. awareness, what's happening to your, I know for me, like, I don't know if you ever had like a soda, like the 6 pack of soda or whatever, it has those like plastic rings on it. And I was taught from a super young age to cut those, any part of those circles up, because I've seen one of those wrapped around a sea lion's neck. And so I've always known that that's something I do. Not that I don't drink a lot of soda, but when it's in the house, that's the first thing I do is I tear or cut those things up so that those things don't happen. Simple things like that, public awareness. We're going to have to control pollution. We've come a long way. We'll talk about that more in the future, but especially I feel like air pollution, we've really controlled significantly in certain areas of the world, but we have more work to do, certainly. And then we have to remember that we're lucky that we're in a developed country, and that not all countries have the same incentive to keep these species alive, when sometimes financially they need these species or a part of these species. And so we have to help with economic incentive in some of these developing countries to make sure that they have buy-in for keeping these species alive or these habitats in place. It would be really great if we could get some more international parks established. There are some. I think it's Costa Rica. I can't remember. Like, we were kind of, the United States was kind of one of the first like national park situations, and we inspired a lot of other countries to have other national parks. And so if we can get that kind of international, then that will really help as well, because there's money in that. So you can use that money to support keeping the habitat there. Of course, supporting research in conservation biology, learning how to conserve is really important, especially, we need to pass that on to the next generation. And we also need to remember that not all species can be saved. Remember that there's always background extinction. What is it, 30-ish species per year do go extinct. And so we have to remember that species will go extinct. We need to also focus on the ones that can be saved. Which ones should be saved? Which ones can be saved? If there's only two newts left in the world and they're both females, does it make sense for us to try to save them, because they can't even reproduce anyway? So you have to you got a number crunch. Um, Population control is a thing too. So sometimes, because we've already messed with these species, sometimes you have to have an artificial method of playing predator. So, for example, these deer, their numbers can get too abundant, and so if they don't have a predator in that area anymore, like let's say there used to be a wolf there and that wolf is missing, and now this population is getting out of control and it's affecting the other habitats, species in the habitat, and things like that. Then sometimes that's why there's hunting season. So you can hunt certain species certain times of year to help them control their population. So that would be sport hunting. And there's also ways to incorporate birth control into certain species as well. I don't know a lot of the details of that, but yeah. So in terms, again, if we're trying to enforce like a man-made predator, if you will, we have to understand the species and their lifestyle, where they are, how many there are, and how many there should be, right? So like, what is a good number for that species? The biggest trick, honestly, is enforcing laws. There's not a lot of manpower dictating who is going out and illegally poaching or whatever. So it's very, very tricky. One of those trigger words is minimum viable population size. You have to establish what is the absolute bare minimum that population can be and still maintain its function. You have to look at males and females. You have to look at genetic diversity. There's a lot of debate. Sometimes there's not a clear answer what the minimum viable population size of a species is. And of course, it's going to range. A panda is going to have a different MVP than a fish species. So those are all things to factor in. All of us must make an effort to reduce our impact on the environment if we want to save plants and animals we share this planet with. So just something to keep in mind. So some problems with this wildlife management approach. Some species don't manage well. So we might try to do something to save it and it doesn't respond to our savings. Tragedy of the commons. By now, when if you're in my class, by the time we get to this point, you'll know what that is at that point. you have to have buy-in from all players. If one person, if let's say you're like, okay, yeah, no one's going to hunt rhinos anymore, and everyone agrees to this, and then one person starts hunting rhinos and they're making a whole bunch of money off of that, and then someone else can be like, well, hey, if they're doing it, I'm doing it. And then all of a sudden everyone's hunting rhinos again. So it's hard to get an agreement on making this happen. It's hard to get people to actually cooperate. And then don't forget that there are cultural rights of Native people. So, for example, the buffalo, let's say the buffalo are significant, or at least were significantly decreased in number, mostly because of white people. And so if we're like, okay, no more hunting buffalo, that's actually not necessarily fair to Native American people, because they have a right to those species as well. And there are lots of indigenous people that have a right, and whether it be in the rainforest or in the outback of Australia, there are Native people that have rights to things. And we often forget about that. Please don't forget about us. Poor little buddies. Notice how they're all mammals? You see what we did there? We pulled at your heartstrings by using the mammals. One thing that has been tested is cloning endangered species. So you guys have probably at least heard of cloning sheep. Dolly, I think it was her name. Maybe you haven't heard of it, but look up the sheep Dolly that they cloned. It really does have to be a last resort. Cloning gets really, really tricky. And if you do some research with Dolly the sheep, you'll see that even if you are cloning the organism, their makeup, you're cloning an older organism. It's not like, because you clone it and then it like hatches from a baby or whatever, but it's not a baby. Like when it's born, it's already however old it was when you cloned it. And so it's just not as efficient, and it's not, we're getting into dangerous territory. So it really does need to be a last resort. And there needs to be, again, a really good reason to do that, because some species do go endangered and then eventually extinct naturally without our input. So we really have to be careful with that one. So that is it for today. Thank you for your time.